Now, I'm sure that money is something that pretty much everyone enjoys and something that everyone wants. But computers are expensive. By the time you get the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, the case, the RGB, the fans, it adds up. But if you want to do PC gaming, but you're on a budget, do you have any good options? Well, I'm going to share with you some really cool tips and tricks I've picked up over time for how to get some really cheap budget parts. Some of the best tips I've got for scrapping parts. And so if you've got anything from like an old laptop to an old desktop lying around, you can probably get some cheap computer parts out of it. Here are a few tips. Now, the first tip has to do with this little device called a power supply. This is a vital part to a computer. You cannot run one without it because it turns the AC from the wall into DC. And this one is broken, like completely. It spat out smoke, it's done for. But that doesn't mean we can't get anything out of it. Now, full disclaimer here. Power supply work is more dangerous than some other PC work. It plays with a lot of high electricity, high voltages, and be very careful about it if you're going to go about it. But there is one main component that you can get from old power supplies. If I just go ahead and unscrew the power supply, 2 screws have been taken out. But more often than not, there's going to be more than that. So make sure you check under things like these QC pass stickers, because as you can see here, they're quite often hidden under them. So I've unscrewed it. If we now lift it open, these are the inner workings of a power supply. We've got some giant capacitors here, some coilings, cable, some cable outs. Pretty much none of this is what we're actually looking for today. What we're looking for is actually this. This is a 120mm fan, and while it only has 2 wires opposed to the usual 3, it can be rewired. Generally, what you can do is rewire this to a 3-pin on the ground and the 12-volt and just leave the sense out. Now, this won't work in all cases, but it should for the most part, allowing us to pull a perfectly good fan out of a dead power supply. But what if I said it could be even simpler than that? Especially because this has a 2-pin header. It's not wired directly on, which leaves us with a fan with a 2-pin. Now, this can be adapted between fairly simply, as I've already said, but there are also plenty of other devices that use this little header. So if you're not necessarily building a PC, you can still pull the fan out. Even though it's just a 2-pin and it's, okay, admittedly not pretty, I've shoved it on. And now, if I turn on the computer... Okay, I had to spin it around because stupidly I put it in the wrong side, but it spins to life. This is now a standard 120mm fan that is spinning, working and pushing a fair amount of air that I got for pretty much free from a dead power supply that could full well just go in your build now. So if you're looking for free case fans, pull apart some dead power supplies. And some older power supplies will even have smaller fans if that's what you need for your case. How cool is that? Definitely clean them off though first. Ugh. For cooling systems, I also want to give an honorable mention. I sadly don't have any dead AIOs lying around, but quite commonly the pump which is inside that will break down in an AIO. It's surprisingly common, and so admittedly, once again, it requires some fandangling, but for the most part, these radiators are completely fine, and you can use them in custom looping. You've got to take them off and take them apart, and you might have to do some dodgy stuff with fittings, but once again, cooling. Dead AIOs, you can get radiators off of. So moving on to the next tip, it's a similar type of tip as the last one. This is an old HP compact. It's a pre-built from a while ago. This is an old PC. But want to know something cool about this old PC? If I open it up, parts inside are not nearly as old. As you see, back as early as 1995, computers were using a format called ATX. Now, while that means certain things are getting outdated, like motherboards, CPUs, all that sort of stuff, because they just can't keep up, other aspects that aren't necessarily as physical, like the case, for instance, are keeping up. They're not going to be the prettiest machine, I'll give you that, but for a budget machine, they're really good option. Even if you just buy an old pre-built, do make sure, some pre-builts aren't ATX, so make sure that it is ATX like this one is. But I got this as a very weak PC for $5. $5 for a micro ATX case is pretty good. Now, they're not always going to be the best cases, but for budget setups, they're going to be more than enough. And the same to a degree goes for coolers, especially because things like Intel stock coolers have a lot of shared mounting, and some that use clips use these shared little plastic rings that you can see here. And so this, if I get the right ring, I can put it on practically any socket. While the last one was getting fans off of broken stuff, there's also a fair bit of old stuff that is still very usable today, that is thrown out, well, because it's old. That if you're on a budget and you're building a budget PC is amazing. Now, admittedly, the last 2 tips have kind of hinged on different things, whether it be having broken computer parts or having old computer parts, which aren't always at your disposal. But if you're looking for some of them, you can get them for cheap and if not free on places like Facebook Marketplace or Gumtree or Craigslist, anything along those lines. You can often get broken parts for free, you just have to pick them up. And I'll admit, I already had a fair bit of this stuff because I work with computers a fair bit. in case the presence of this channel wasn't obvious. But there's one thing that a lot of people have. Old laptops. This is an old Lenovo, which admittedly still works. If I go to Task Manager, the specs are kind of pathetic. And so it's not really going to be able to be used for anything. Sort of. Because I'll tell you now, this may be a weak old laptop that has with a dodgy battery, but it's still got useful things in it. If I open up the back here, this is the machine itself. And now there are two majorly and easily removable parts here. The SSD, because this is an M.2 SSD, which is compatible with computers, and the SODIMM RAM. You can get SODIMM RAM from PCs like this. Now this is DDR3, and once again SODIMM, which raises two major problems. One, it's still small capacity, and two, it's small in general. Well, for the it's small in general issue, there are heaps of adapters you can get on things like eBay for far cheaper than a standard memory stick for SODIMM to a standard DIMM actually. They're surprisingly effective. But the other thing is that there's another benefit to building a PC versus using a laptop for this exact issue. This laptop has one SODIMM DIMM. That's all it can take. If I just for a second go to a PC, this PC has 4 different DIMMs of memory in it. Let's say I got 4 of these, suddenly we've gone from 4 gigs to 16. And even though it's DDR3, for a budget build, DDR3 today, while it's starting to go out of style, for budget builds, it's still not a bad option. So you can pull and use the RAM from laptops quite easily. And these SSDs come out. Admittedly, not all budget motherboards will have an M.2 slot. A surprisingly large amount will. And even if you don't get an M.2 one, you'll notice there's this really big slot over here. That's where very occasionally, with an SSD like this, which is a standard 2.5-inch SSD, which would go in like that. But usually if they've got an SSD, they've got an M.2. More commonly down here, there will be 2.5-inch hard drives, which are standard SATA and a great option for PC builds. They might need a little bit of adapting and a little bit of makeshift to put it into a case, but it'll fit. And to those saying, oh, it's slow, and oh, usually the capacity isn't that high. Usually, they won't be more than 5,400 RPM. When it's already free and coming from a laptop, that's not a great amount of storage, but it'll do the trick. It'll get the job done. And especially if it's free coming out of a laptop anyway, there's no harm in adding it. And if it's just for game storage, especially on a budget machine, it'll do the trick and be surprisingly good. Budget machines are undervalued nowadays because there are so many gaming PCs like this one here, which cost a lot of money but are really powerful and run games really well. And people have started to assume that that's what you need to do gaming, as there are so many YouTube channels and videos that show off these high-end gaming PCs, but that's just not what you need. If you want that, that's wonderful. I'm not discouraging that. Powerful gaming PCs, as you've seen, I've got one. If you want one, that's great. But there's a difference between a want and a need. The fact is, to play the game, you don't need all that extra power. You could probably run it on a 1050 Ti, DDR3 RAM, all that sort of stuff. It just runs better on a more powerful computer. But for not everyone has that option. And so that's why these tips are so useful for someone building a budget PC. They come in handy, and the fact is they're so useful. On some PCs, what might be 5% of a budget for fans, other people are trying to get the cheapest option they can. They just want it to work. Even the smallest things like fans, if you get that money away from that, you can put it to something else and then end up with a more powerful PC. That's one of the reasons I think these tips are so useful. And even for the main components themselves, we're not talking about the side bits, you've got options. For instance, a little hack I like to use for budget PCs is a line from Intel called an Xeon. I've actually got one just here. This is an Intel Xeon. It's an old server processor. But you see, these server processors tend to go out of date. And so things like servers and data centers get rid of them in mass. And so on eBay right now, there are plenty of Xeon options that have really good specs that'll only go for like 20 bucks for a good CPU. The CPU I have under this cooler, it's on an X58 chipset, 16 gigs of DDR3. It's an Xeon X5690, which has 6 cores, 12 threads, 3.46 base clock, and I got it for 40 bucks on eBay. Obviously something like a Ryzen is gonna beat it, or a later generation Intel. But there are tricks you can do that are further than just buying secondhand. I don't think people realize just how cheaply you can get a half-decent computer. I absolutely love building budget gaming PCs. And there are all the standard tips like secondhand, whatnot, which I've talked about in the past. But in this video, I just really want to talk about some of the more subtle things that you might not think about, like salvaging or using non-standard product lines. If you end up using any of these tips, please let me know. Chuck it in the comments. I'm actually really curious if these tips help anyone. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I'm a small creator and it would help out a ton. If you want to see any of my other videos, make sure you click one of the buttons on screen now, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye!